Have you ever noticed that the more you chase happiness, the more it seems to slip away? The harder you try to feel alive, the more numb you become. I want to share something profound with you today. Something that might completely transform how you experience life. You see, most people are running, constantly running towards goals, running from pain, running to connect, running to succeed. But they've forgotten the most fundamental truth of existence, the power of absolute silence. I'm not talking about the superficial silence of turning off your phone for an hour. I'm talking about a silence so deep that it penetrates every fiber of your being, a silence that transforms your entire existence. Let me tell you why cutting all contacts and embracing silence might be the most revolutionary thing you'll ever do. You see, we've been conditioned to believe that constant connection is strength, that being available 24/7 is success, that constant communication is living, but this is precisely what's killing us softly. Think about this for a moment. When was the last time you sat in complete silence with no purpose, no goal, no destination? When was the last time you allowed yourself to simply be without the need to prove anything to anyone? The most people are terrified of silence. They fill every moment with noise, social media, conversations, music, podcasts, anything to avoid facing the vast emptiness within. But what they don't realize is that this emptiness they're running from is actually the source of all life, all creativity, all genuine power. I've spent years observing how people live, and I've noticed something fascinating. The more connected people become, the more disconnected they feel. The more friends they have on social media, the lonelier they become. The more they try to feel alive through external stimulation, the more dead they feel inside. But here's the secret that few understand. True aliveness comes from embracing silence. Complete, total, absolute silence. Not just external silence, but internal silence. The kind of silence that comes when you cut all unnecessary contacts and allow yourself to simply be. You might think this sounds extreme. You might wonder, how can I just cut off all contacts? What about my responsibilities? What about my relationships? But I'm not talking about becoming a hermit. I'm talking about something far more subtle and powerful. When you begin to embrace silence, something extraordinary happens. You start to notice that most of your contacts, most of your connections, most of your communications are actually forms of escape. They're ways of avoiding the profound truth of your own existence. You see, we've created a world where being constantly available is seen as normal. We're expected to respond instantly to messages, to be always on, always connected. But this constant connection is actually a form of profound disconnection. Disconnection from yourself, from reality, from the raw essence of life. Think about how much energy you spend maintaining superficial connections. The endless scroll through social media, the meaningless small talk, the obligatory check-ins, the constant need to validate your existence through others' responses. All of this is draining your life force. I've observed that the most powerful transformations happen when people dare to cut these connections. Not permanently, not completely, but consciously. When they dare to step into the void of silence and stay there long enough to let something new emerge. You see, in silence, you begin to hear something that's been trying to speak to you all along. Not a voice, not words, but something far more profound. The pulse of existence itself. This is what most people are missing. They're so busy trying to feel alive through external stimulation that they miss the very essence of aliveness. Consider this. Every great insight, every profound realization, Every genuine transformation in human history has come from moments of deep silence. Not from networking, not from socializing, not from endless communication, but from the depths of silence. When you cut unnecessary contacts, you're not just creating space in your schedule, you're creating space in your being, space for something new to emerge, space for your true nature to reveal itself, space for genuine aliveness to bubble up from within. But here's what most people don't understand about this process. It's not comfortable. When you first step into silence, when you first cut those unnecessary connections, it feels like dying. Your ego, which has been sustained by constant external validation, begins to panic. This is where most people turn back. They can't bear the discomfort of facing themselves without the buffer of constant distraction. They mistake the death of their false self for the death of their true self. But if you can stay with it, if you can remain in that silence, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to experience a kind of aliveness that doesn't depend on external stimulation. You begin to feel a power that doesn't need validation. You discover a presence that's been there all along, waiting for you to notice it. The fascinating thing about this journey into silence is that it reveals how much of our lives is spent in unnecessary noise. Think about your daily interactions. How many of them are truly essential? How many are just habitual patterns of avoiding yourself? I've watched people transform completely when they dare to embrace this path. Their eyes change, their presence changes, their entire way of being in the world shifts. Not because they've added something, but because they've allowed something to fall away. You see, most people think they need to acquire more to feel alive, more connections, more experiences, more achievements. But true aliveness comes from subtraction, not addition. It comes from removing the layers of noise that have accumulated over your essential nature. When you cut contacts, you're not just changing your social habits. You're performing a profound act of trust in life itself. You're declaring that you don't need constant external reinforcement to exist. You're stepping out of the matrix of continuous distraction into something far more real. Consider how nature operates. A seed doesn't need constant communication to grow. It doesn't need validation to become what it is. It simply needs space, silence, and the right conditions. You are no different. Your growth, your transformation, your genuine aliveness requires the same elements. But here's what makes this journey so challenging. We've been conditioned to believe that being alone is dangerous, that silence is empty, that disconnection is death. This conditioning runs so deep that it feels like truth, but it's not truth, it's just programming. The reality is that your most profound connection to life comes through silence. Your deepest wisdom emerges in solitude. Your true power awakens when you dare to disconnect from the constant chatter of the world and connect with the silence at your core. I remember observing how people behave in crowds versus in solitude. In crowds, they're like actors playing parts, wearing masks, performing expected roles. But in solitude, in silence, something else emerges, something authentic, something real, something truly alive. The most fascinating thing happens when you maintain silence consistently. You begin to recognize how much of your energy was being drained by superficial connections. It's like discovering you've been living with a constant leak in your life force, and suddenly that leak is sealed. Think about the last time you felt truly alive. I mean, really, genuinely alive. Was it during a moment of intense social interaction? Or Was it in a moment of profound silence, perhaps watching a sunset or walking alone in nature or sitting quietly in the early morning hours? You see, what most people call feeling alive is actually just stimulation. It's the temporary high of external excitement. But true aliveness is something entirely different. It's a state of being that emerges when you stop running from silence and start embracing it. I've noticed that people who constantly seek connection often fear something deep within themselves. They're running from an emptiness they've never dared to face. But here's the paradox. That very emptiness, when embraced, becomes the source of their greatest fulfillment. When you cut unnecessary contacts, you begin to distinguish between genuine connections and merely habitual ones. You start to see how many of your relationships are based on mutual distraction rather than genuine sharing. This clarity can be uncomfortable at first, but it's incredibly liberating. Consider how much of your mental space is occupied by managing relationships that don't truly serve your growth. The social obligations, the superficial check-ins, the endless stream of digital communications. All of these create a kind of static that drowns out the signal of your own inner wisdom. But when you embrace silence, when you consciously cut these unnecessary connections, something remarkable happens. The static begins to clear. The signal becomes stronger. You start to hear the subtle guidance that's always been there, but was drowned out by the noise. The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require any special techniques or complicated practices. It simply requires the courage to be silent, to disconnect, to allow space to open up in your life. It's not about doing something new. It's about stopping what's unnecessary. What most people don't realize is that their fear of silence is actually fear of their own power. When you're constantly connected to others, constantly seeking validation and approval, you're actually diluting your natural power. You're dispersing your energy in 1,000 different directions. Think about water for a moment. When water is spread thin, it has little power. But when it's channeled, focused, contained, it becomes incredibly powerful. Your energy works the same way. When you cut unnecessary contacts and embrace silence, you're channeling your life force instead of dispersing it. I've observed that the modern world has created a peculiar kind of addiction, an addiction to distraction. People have become so uncomfortable with their own company that they'll do almost anything to avoid it. They'll engage in meaningless conversations, scroll endlessly through social media, consume endless content, anything to avoid the silence. But here's what's really happening beneath the surface. Every time you run from silence, you're running from your own power. Every time you fill the space with unnecessary noise, you're drowning out the voice of your own wisdom. Every time you seek connection out of fear of being alone, you're betraying your own completeness. The transformation begins when you start treating silence as your ally rather than your enemy. When you begin to see that those empty spaces in your life aren't really empty at all. They're full of potential, full of power, full of possibility. They're the fertile ground from which genuine aliveness springs. Consider how nature works. The most powerful forces in nature operate in silence. Gravity doesn't make a sound as it holds galaxies together. Trees don't shout as they grow. The earth doesn't announce its spinning. The most profound powers operate in absolute silence. When you cut contacts and embrace silence, you're aligning yourself with these fundamental forces of nature. You're stepping out of the artificial world of constant noise and into the natural rhythm of existence. This isn't about becoming antisocial. It's about becoming genuinely connected to life itself. The fascinating thing is that when you embrace this path, your relationships actually improve. Not because you're trying to make them better, but because you're no longer approaching them from a place of need. You're no longer using others to fill your inner emptiness. You see, when you learn to be comfortable in silence, when you can sit with yourself without needing distraction, something remarkable happens to your presence. You begin to emanate a different kind of energy. People can feel it, even if they can't explain it. I've noticed that those who embrace silence develop a magnetic quality, not because they're trying to be attractive, but because they've tapped into something real. They've touched the core of genuine aliveness, and it radiates from them naturally, effortlessly. Think about the last time you met someone who seemed completely at peace with themselves. They probably weren't the loudest person in the room. They probably weren't trying to prove anything. They had a quiet strength, a settled presence that came from being comfortable with silence. This is what becomes available to you when you cut unnecessary contacts and embrace silence. You develop a kind of gravitational field. People are drawn to you not because you're seeking their attention, but because you've found something real within yourself. The irony is that when you stop seeking connection desperately, genuine connections begin to find you. When you stop trying to feel alive through others, true aliveness begins to emerge from within. When you embrace silence, the right words begin to flow naturally. Consider how many words are wasted in the world. How many conversations are just noise? How many relationships are just mutual distractions? When you step back from all this, when you allow yourself to sink into silence, you begin to recognize the profound difference between connection and mere contact. Most people live their entire lives at the level of contact. They touch the surface of life, the surface of relationships, the surface of themselves, but they never dive deep enough to experience true connection. They never allow themselves to be silent enough to hear the deeper currents of existence. But when you dare to cut those surface level contacts, when you dare to dive beneath the noise, you discover something extraordinary. You find that what you've been seeking in all those external connections was actually within you all along. The aliveness you've been chasing was always here, waiting in the silence. The most fascinating transformation occurs in how you experience time. When you're constantly connected, constantly responding to others, time seems to slip away. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months, but in silence, time takes on a different quality. It deepens. It expands. You begin to experience the richness of each moment. I've watched people discover this truth for themselves. At first, they resist it. The silence feels threatening. The lack of constant contact feels like death. But if they stay with it, if they allow themselves to sink into that silence, they begin to experience time in a completely new way. Think about how much of your life is spent reacting to others, responding to messages, managing expectations, navigating social dynamics. Now imagine all that energy being redirected inward. Imagine all that attention being focused on the present moment, on your actual lived experience. This is what becomes possible when you cut unnecessary contacts. You're not just creating space in your schedule. You're creating space in your consciousness. You're allowing yourself to experience life directly without the constant filter of other people's opinions, expectations, and demands. What the beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require you to become a different person. It doesn't ask you to adopt new beliefs or learn complex techniques. It simply invites you to stop. Stop running. Stop avoiding. Stop filling every moment with noise. Just stop and be silent. Consider how rare genuine silence has become in our world. Even when people are physically alone, they fill their space with music, podcasts, videos, anything to avoid facing the silence. But what if that silence isn't your enemy? What if it's actually the doorway to everything you've been seeking? When you embrace silence, you begin to notice things you've never noticed before. The subtle movements of your own breath, the way thoughts arise and dissolve, the feeling of being alive in your own body. These aren't small things. They're the very essence of existence that most people miss in their rush to feel alive through external stimulation. The transformation of consciousness that happens in silence is beyond what words can describe. It's like discovering a new dimension of existence that was always there, but hidden beneath the noise of constant connection. It's like waking up from a dream you didn't know you were in. The most profound realization comes when you discover that silence isn't empty. It's full of intelligence, full of energy, full of possibility. When you cut unnecessary contacts and allow yourself to rest in silence, you're not retreating from life, you're stepping into its fullness. I've observed that people often confuse being alone with being lonely, but these are completely different experiences. Loneliness comes from disconnection from yourself, not from others. You can be surrounded by people and feel desperately lonely, or you can be completely alone and feel deeply connected to life. Think about the quality of your attention when you're constantly connected to others. It's divided, scattered, fragmented. But in silence, your attention naturally unifies. It becomes whole, concentrated, powerful. This unified attention is what allows you to experience life in its full depth and richness. The fascinating thing about embracing silence is how it changes your relationship with everything. Colors become more vivid. Sounds become more clear. Thoughts become more precise. It's as if you're experiencing life in high definition for the first time. Most people live their entire lives at low resolution, their consciousness clouded by constant noise and distraction. But when you cut unnecessary contacts and embrace silence, it's like cleaning a window that's been dirty for years. Suddenly, everything becomes crystal clear. Consider how much energy you spend maintaining an image of yourself for others. The constant adjustment, the continuous performance, the endless management of impressions. In silence, all of that falls away. You're left with something far more real, your actual unfiltered experience of being alive. The power that emerges from this practice isn't the power of dominance or control. It's the power of presence, of authenticity, of being completely aligned with what is. This power doesn't need to announce itself or prove anything. It simply is. When you learn to be comfortable in silence, you develop a kind of immunity to manipulation. You're no longer easily swayed by others' opinions or expectations. You have a solid center, a quiet confidence that comes from knowing yourself deeply. The transformation that occurs in silence isn't just personal. It affects everything around you. Your presence becomes a silent invitation for others to find their own depth. Without saying a word, you demonstrate that there's another way to live, another way to be. I've watched how this silent transformation ripples out into the world. When one person dares to step out of the constant noise and into genuine presence, it creates a field of possibility that affects everyone they encounter. not through preaching or teaching, but through pure being. Think about the quality of your relationships when you're always available, always connected. They tend to stay superficial based on convenience and habit rather than genuine connection. But when you embrace silence, when you become selective about your contacts, something remarkable happens. Your relationships develop depth. The paradox is that by being less available, you become more present. By communicating less, your words carry more weight. By connecting less frequently, your connections become more meaningful. This is the alchemy that silence makes possible. Consider how rare it is in today's world to meet someone who is fully present, someone who isn't constantly divided between here and elsewhere, between now and later. When you embrace silence, you naturally become such a person. Your presence becomes a gift to everyone you encounter. Most people are afraid that if they disconnect, if they embrace silence, they'll miss out on something important. But what they don't realize is that by staying constantly connected, they're missing out on the most important thing of all, the direct experience of being alive. The power that emerges from silence isn't something you need to cultivate or develop. It's already there, like an underground spring waiting to be uncovered. All you need to do is remove the layers of noise and distraction that have been covering it up. When you cut unnecessary contacts and embrace silence, you're not just changing your behavior, you're changing your entire relationship with existence. You're moving from a position of constant seeking to one of natural being, from endless doing to effortless presence. The most profound shift happens in how you experience your own thoughts. In constant connection, thoughts tend to be reactive, influenced by others' opinions and expectations. But in silence, thoughts begin to arise from a deeper place. They become more original, more authentic, more truly your own. I've noticed that when people first embrace silence, they often experience a kind of withdrawal. Their mind, addicted to constant stimulation, rebels against the quiet. But if they persist, something beautiful begins to happen. The mind naturally settles, like muddy water becoming clear. Think about how many of your daily thoughts are actually responses to others, reactions to messages, replies to comments, preparations for conversations. In silence, you begin to hear your own original thoughts, perhaps for the first time. It's like discovering your own inner voice beneath years of accumulated noise. The fascinating thing about this journey is how it changes your perception of time. In constant connection, time feels scarce, always running out. But in silence, time expands. You begin to experience the fullness of each moment, the depth of each breath, the richness of simply being. Consider how much of your life energy is dispersed in maintaining unnecessary connections. Each notification, each response, each interaction takes a little bit of your vitality. In silence, this energy naturally consolidates. It becomes available for deeper purposes, for genuine creativity and growth. Most people live on the surface of their own consciousness, skimming across the waves of endless stimulation. But when you embrace silence, you begin to sink beneath the surface. You discover depths within yourself that you never knew existed. The power that emerges from this practice isn't about controlling or manipulating life. It's about aligning with life's natural flow. When you cut unnecessary contacts and embrace silence, you naturally fall into rhythm with something larger than yourself. This alignment brings a kind of effortless power. You no longer need to force things or push against life. Instead, you move with life, like a skilled surfer riding a wave. This is the true meaning of power, not domination, but harmonious action.